Welcome to the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network. You're listening to a new episode of the Founder Pack Podcast, where your host, Brendan Rod, brings startup stories from experienced founders and other functional experts to help current and future founders get inspired and grow their knowledge with quick, tactical insights. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
I missed the whole cheesy countdown. Okay. So, hey, Dan, welcome to the Founder Pack Podcast. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me, Brendan. Good to be here.
Thank you so much for joining. So, first things first, you're based out of Perth. You said Sydney? Sorry,
yeah, Sydney in Australia. Yeah, so down under.
And you just mentioned that you're like traveling. So, what's happening in your world at the moment?
Yeah, well, this morning I'm flying to Melbourne just for the weekend. It's just a small trip, but I actually did just come back from a trip through the US and to Singapore. I was away for a month. It was the first time I'd been overseas, international travel, since pre-pandemic. And it was great. It was great to be out of the country. But we were talking off camera. I have to say the travel situation in Australia and the US and everywhere, frankly, is pretty tough at the moment. I really feel for the ground staff. There's not enough people working, but it does make for pretty challenging transit conditions.
Yeah, I've seen and heard a lot of nightmare stories. So aside from that, hopefully it was enjoyable. Was it business or pleasure?
Predominantly business. Yeah, I did a short little getaway up to Canada for a few days, but I was visiting investors, customers. Funnily enough, we did our Series C round in September last year. And I hadn't actually met any of our investors face to face. Well, I'd met some of the Australian ones who invested, but none of our American investors I'd met face to face. We did everything over Zoom. So part of the trip was just to go and actually meet them and get to know them a little bit and put a face to the name. So that was really cool.
Awesome. And how is the tech scene and the cybersecurity scene in Australia? And, what is the investor scene like? Did you raise money in Australia or outside of Australia?
Yeah, great question. So I mean, let me just give you a bit of context. For me, I had my first startup in my early 20s in the early noughties, sort of started around 2002, 2003. There was no venture capital in Australia then really at all. But the scene is very, very different now. There's particularly in Sydney and to a degree in Melbourne, the two biggest cities, there is a burgeoning scene. I think we've had quite a lot of fantastic tech success stories, not just tech, but, business success stories over the last years. And I think we're starting to see the flow-on effects from those successes. So Canva, Atlassian, Safety Culture, to name a few. So there's a lot more funding in Australia. There are a lot of really successful businesses. And because you've had lots of successful businesses, there's also a lot of talent, tech talent and otherwise. We actually ended up raising really about 50-50 of our round from US money and Australian money. One of the things we did early on, and a lot of Australians will use the phrase they're going to flip up. And so flipping up their company means we're going to take the Australian company that we've incorporated and make that the wholly owned subsidiary of the American entity. So we incorporated in Delaware C Corp as you always do, and that allowed us to raise money from some US investors as well. But honestly, there is a fantastic startup scene in Australia now, significantly different to where it was even maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I can't say the same yet for cyber. So I think cyber is not as advanced or as mature as it is, say, in the States or in other areas like Israel. but it is growing. There's a sort of a strong interest in cybersecurity kind of across the industry generally, and there are now some more startups popping up. Obviously, my own startup, and I'm friendly with the founders of a number of others. So it's slowly getting there, but it's probably lags a little bit behind other areas.
I'm sure I'll pick your brain and we'll sort of get to know you and the scene more throughout the show. So kind of give us a short background about you and your company and what your company does.
So my name is Dan Draper. I'm an Aussie founder and software engineer by training. I'm the founder and CEO of CipherStash, and we build tools to help developers make applications more secure by allowing them to use searchable encryption technology in the applications they build.
Is this a novel solution, or are you breaking into any new categories? Maybe just a little background on that.
Yeah, in a way, I think we are. We've had this debate many times over the kind of course of CipherStash's life. Is this a new product in an existing category, or is it a new category? It's often the debate when you're dealing with innovation and new products. I think of this as a new category. Frankly, it's based on some really interesting technology. We've spent years researching and developing this technology, and in turn, that was based on some research that came out of Stanford. In particular, a paper that was published in 2016. But even that was based on years of research and prior art. So there's a lot of interesting innovation and technology built into the product in order to support what we're trying to do.
Can you give us like a 30-second pitch?
Of course. It's funny. The idea of an elevator pitch is kind of dead to me now. It's more like the Zoom pitch.
I like it.
So CipherStash is what we think of as removing the final blocker for developers to use encryption. So if you think about encryption, it is really the best possible way to protect sensitive data. So if you're a developer that's building an application that stores PII, personally identifiable information, health information, financial transaction records, and so forth, really, there is very little excuse these days for you to not use what we call application-level encryption, to encrypt everything in the database. The problem is that most developers who are building applications still don't do that. Now, why? The reason is quite simple. As soon as you enable encryption like that, you lose the ability to query the data. So if you've got a healthcare database, for example, and you want to look up a patient by their social security number or their Medicare number in Australia, you can't do that. You want to find all patients over the age of 40, you can't do that. Even something as simple as creating a dashboard with your some names of your customers on it and ordering those names by, say, their name, you can't do that either. And so CipherStash augments an existing database in such a way that you can enable encryption as a developer, but retain the ability to perform those queries that you are, utterly dependent on to build your application. So it's, like I say, we see it as the removing that final blocker for a developer using encryption in their application, and thus significantly improving the security of their data.
Great. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate it. Sticking with tradition, and seeing as though I've never interviewed anyone from Australia before, maybe you can share one fun fact about yourself.
I think this is a funny one. I always find it funny anyway. So my wife is a singer, a vocalist, and she's a lyricist. She's very in tune with song lyrics. I don't have anything against song lyrics, but I have this issue where I just can never seem to know what the lyrics are. I hear something completely different, and I come up with not intentionally, but some very unusual lyrics. I'll give you one example. So I don't remember the name of it.
It's encrypted somehow.
Exactly.
No pun intended.
Exactly. Yeah, the lyrics are encrypted in my head, but it comes out quite funny sometimes. So there's a song. I don't know, it goes every time that you walk in the room. For years as a kid, I used to think that was every time that you kangaroo. I know now as an adult that that's clearly not the lyrics, but for whatever reason, as a kid, that's what I thought it was. And so, even nowadays, I hear things and I go, oh, that's clearly not what they're saying, but that's what I heard. My wife and I think it's hilarious. So anyway, that's a fun fact about me.
I think that will do just fine. So I appreciate
No worries.
that. So circling back to the beginning discussion we had around funding and investors, would you say that the behavior or the investments available in Australia are mimicking the behaviors happening in the US around the recession? Like, is the situation the same, or is there more money going around in Australia? And I don't know, for our Australian listeners, maybe you have some recommendations on, raising seed money and even post-seed money, if there's any insights you can share.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a lot of things about the Australian funding ecosystem that are quite similar to the US ecosystem, but there are some important differences. And I think one of the things I've noticed is you almost think of Australia as an America light sometimes. It's similar but kind of subdued in many ways. So, in 2021, we obviously had a very frothy market internationally and particularly in the US. And there was a little bit of that frothiness in Australia, but not to the same degree. But equally, I would say that now that things seem to be cooling off a little bit, they don't seem to be cooling off as much in Australia as they were in the States. I think Australians have always had the challenge that we kind of need to work doubly hard to make it in Europe or the US, where miles away, and we have a smaller market, and we're a bit disconnected from a lot of the things that are happening in America, and so we've had to, as founders, I speak sort of broadly about the ecosystem, and I think a lot of other founders will say the same thing. We've had to focus on building revenue, building traction a lot earlier than I think our American counterparts, and that means that when companies like Australian companies do raise funding, there tends to be a stronger narrative there about why they're raising and how much they need to raise and so forth. Of course, it's not always true, but it's a trend I've noticed, and I think I've heard other founders say as well. I think the other really interesting thing that separates the Australian ecosystem from other bigger markets like the US is there tends to be a lot more specialization in the US because there's so many more funds, there's so much more money available. There are quite a lot of funds that are very specialized. Like there's lots of, agri-tech funds and cybersecurity funds and, consumer retail funds. Whereas in Australia, we don't tend to get that much of that. So you have a lot more generalist funds, which is not a problem necessarily, but it does mean sometimes there is a little bit of information asymmetry. If you've got a highly specialized business, like for example, a cybersecurity business, not all funds are going to get your product immediately. There will be a handful that have a leaning towards a particular industry or a space, but I think that is one of the challenges. I've pitched to US funds that are specialized and focus on cyber or understand this space really well, and they get what we're doing immediately. And there's been a handful of folks in Australia that have, but it's much harder to find people that are specialized enough to get what we're doing.
Can you sort of share some successes or recommendations on what led you to be successful in raising your seed round, in terms of outreach to investors and maybe how you presented your story through your presentation?
Yeah, there's a few things. I think I'll start by saying I was very fortunate. There was I suppose a little bit of privilege in this early phase of the business, and that I had. This is not my first rodeo. I've been involved with many other startups as an executive, as a CTO and VP of engineering and so forth, and I've also had a couple of my own startups. So I already had a good network of angels and other kind of investors. I my first round really was, people call it a friends and family round. I didn't have any money from family, but I had a lot of angel investors who I call my friends who invested, and that was purely initially through my network. Quite a lot of folks I knew personally, and then they would introduce me to more people that they knew personally, and it sort of grew from there. And so I ended up raising my first round. We ended up with, I think, 13 angels in the cap table, which was it's a lot. And you might be forgiven for thinking, well, why have such a complex cap table at such an early stage? And the key thing to remember at that early round is that it's not actually about the cash. I think we raised 250K Australian, so maybe a couple of 100,000 American equivalent. But the people that joined the cap table were the kinds of people that could open doors for me, provide advice, had skill sets that complemented mine, that I'm strong in some areas and not as strong in others. So, when I talk to any other founder that's going through this process, that first round has got to be about who do you want to spend the next 5 or 6 years or longer with, and how are they going to add value to your business well beyond just money? Because that 250 grand doesn't last long in a startup. That's all gone. But my angels are still with me, and they're very interested in the success of the business. And then kind of moving on to the seed round, when we started talking to venture capitalists, once again the networking component of it was really, really important. It was important to have introductions, important to have a network. And this was a network that I'd been building for years. It was people that I'd spoken to. I remember speaking to one fund. I think the first time that I actually spoke to them was back in 2013, and was a completely different opportunity. They didn't invest at that time, but I knew them, and they said, if you've ever got any other ideas in the future, come and talk to us. And so it was years later when I finally did. I said, hey, I've got this other thing. You want to take a look at it? I think it is hard to build a network, and it doesn't mean that if you don't have a network that you can't raise. I think increasingly these days funds are becoming more open to cold outreach. But if you have an opportunity, even if you don't have a business idea in mind yet, get along to startup events, ask for introductions to VCs or funds. Get to know the people in the ecosystem, so that when you do come to raise, you'll be in a good starting position to do that. I can't remember who the quote came from, but there was a famous quote from an investor that said, "As an investor, you shouldn't invest in dots. You should invest in lines." I just heard a beep, so I'm going to say that again. You should invest in lines, not dots. So what they mean by that is, if you're an investor and you're tracking all of the interactions that you're having with a founder, and you put them on a graph, you should see a nice, almost continuous line. You're constantly checking in. They're constantly hearing from you. They see you on social media. They get your newsletter. They see you at events. You take them for coffee once in a while, as opposed to a company that you've never even spoken to, or you've heard of kind of vaguely or loosely in the community, and then all of a sudden they're asking you for millions of dollars. It's a much harder sell. And then I guess finally the last interesting piece of advice, this is more of a trick I've learned over the years, and I think a lot of other founders will say this too if they've gone through the process. If you ask for advice, you'll get funding. If you ask for funding, you'll get advice. It's a quote that's always resonated with me. I think when
my last guest literally said the exact same thing.
Yeah, maybe that's not new advice then, but it's certainly a nugget of wisdom that has resonated with me and proven quite valuable. So that's cool.
Yeah, well, at least we have two guests and 2 data points to confirm that this strategy works.
Yeah.
So if we go back to outreach, what you're saying is your outreach game should actually begin miles in advance to when you actually need the funding.
Yeah.
Like even if you're not ready to raise, you should start planting seeds without sort of spilling too much of the beans.
Well, firstly, I mean, you're absolutely right. You should be planting seeds as early as possible. It can be a distraction. Don't get me wrong. Like it does take time to make this investment, but I'm firmly of the belief that starting to build relationships with investors even well before you're ready to raise is an incredibly valuable exercise. And you may not know those investors. You might have to get introductions to them, or you might have to go out of your way to find an opportunity to meet them, or you might have to just cold outreach, and a lot of those funds won't respond to you, but you send enough messages and eventually someone will respond. And I think in that case, it's about refining the pitch. Don't be afraid to ask for feedback. Don't be offended if you don't get any feedback. I've had funds. I'll give you one example on that front, actually. I got introduced to, I won't name them, but they're a large, famous fund. I got introduced to them by a friend of mine and a really advisor of mine in Australia. And I pitched to them. It didn't go very well, frankly. I think we were too early for them. I don't think they quite got it. They're a big fund. They get a lot of people pitching to them. And so, I think they just didn't have the time to really unpack what I was saying to them. And so I realized I needed to improve my pitch, and we had some more progress to make on the product front. But what was really interesting is we kept putting our message out there. We have an investor mailing list. We post stuff on our LinkedIn page and Twitter and so forth, and we're just constantly out there telling the world about what we're doing. And every time we do that, we're saying things to both customers and investors. And what happened in this case, this particular fund, they obviously spotted something in our outward comms, and they reached out again, maybe 6 months later, and they said, we spoke 6 months ago, so you've made some progress. Is it worth another chat? And I'm like, hang on, what's going on here? Like, you guys ghosted me, and now you want another conversation. But what I realized was, I mean, they only ghosted me because they're busy. I think it wasn't the right timing, and they just didn't have time to manage the relationship well, and that was something I had to accept. But the fact that they'd seen our progress and sort of must have thought to themselves, well, they weren't quite right for us before, but we can see that they've got hustle, can see that they're making progress, and I think it's worth another conversation. And now we're actually in serious conversations with them. So even if you have an investor that maybe doesn't seem like the right fit or doesn't seem like they're interested, you have now built a relationship with them, you started the relationship with them, and it doesn't mean that it's over. A no is just a no now. It doesn't mean that they won't come around. And actually, funnily enough, I would say the same is true of customers. We've lost deals because we just weren't ready as a company. And now, 6 months on, those deals are kind of coming back into the fold because the product's developed, the team's developed. Some of the objections that they had previously have dissipated. So I think it's true on both sides. You've just got to keep the pressure on, I suppose. Not aggressively, but make sure that you're ever present, always there.
That's great advice. Like just kind of staying top of mind. It doesn't take that much work as long as somehow you're able to get in front of them on a cadence, whether it's, like you said, a newsletter, your social media, hopefully they're following you, and then those milestones will hopefully rack up and get that call back or whatever it is. So we spoke about tactics to get those meetings and stay top of mind, asking for advice versus asking, for funding. Once you've gotten like your intros and your meetings, what did you find was the most important framework to pitching and getting that like yes or learning from the no? Some examples could be in how you messaged. Did you sometimes kill people with, death by PowerPoint? So yeah, if we could go to the presentation phase.
Yeah. So I'm a little bit unconventional in that regard, I guess. The traditional approach when you're talking to investors is to use a slide deck, PowerPoint or whatever. I all of the times I've done that, the pitch hasn't gone very well. Now, maybe that's a reflection of the slide deck. Maybe it's the way that I'm speaking or interacting with the investor when I'm talking to a deck. I'm not sure, but I found that the best way for me to articulate what we're doing and to build rapport with the investor was to tell them a story. Tell them the story of why I started CipherStash, the challenges that I was facing, how I built the prototype, how I found my team, and together we've continued to build this amazing business. And that's the thing that's resonating with them. I think there's a couple of things to unpack there. One is potentially the stage of the business. In the early stages, like a seed round, maybe even up to Series A, but certainly in pre-seed and seed, investors are investing in you, the founder or founders, and the vision for the business. And so it's going to be very narrative based. It's going to be, you probably don't have any numbers. Maybe you don't have any customers, or there are very few customers. You probably don't know what your unit metrics are. So how to convince an investor is very much more about the vision and story you're telling them. And so I think that's what's worked for us, is that I go through that story. It's the narrative. And fortunately, I seem to be reasonably good at that, and that seems to have resonated well with investors, and we were successful in raising our fund. In fact, it was oversubscribed. I think, we haven't gone, obviously we haven't done a Series A or B at CipherStash yet, but I have been involved with other companies. I was in the leadership team that have gone through A, B, and C funding. And I think the conversation changes a little bit as you get further down the investment pipeline, the investment journey, I suppose. Because once you get to Series A and beyond, and certainly Series B, investors care about numbers. So I bought into this story. I like you as a founder. I believe in your vision, but how are you actually making this work? Have you got paying customers? What are your unit economics? So, how much is it costing to acquire a company? How much are they churning? Those kinds of things. And the conversation changes, I think, quite dramatically at that stage. And so that's potentially when the deck approach is significantly more valuable. More than likely, investors already know who you are. There may be existing investors and you're pitching to them for follow-on, or there might be people that are, you haven't pitched to before, but they're aware of you because you've been around for a while and they've seen announcements from other investors and so forth. Most VCs pay quite a bit of attention to who's investing in who. So I think that's when the kind of conversation shifts quite a lot.
So actually, the deck could be used more as of an internal, like building your story in your mind and having it on paper so that you can present it naturally without worrying about the presentation, the slides, and having people look at the slides. Like, the point of the deck is just to document it so that you can go and present it.
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, I do refer to the deck in meetings. I think that there serves a couple of other purposes, though, and at least in my case. Yeah.
And for follow-up, potentially.
Precisely. Exactly what I was just going to say. I think you send the deck over, after these conversations, investors virtually every single time will ask me, can you send me a deck? Have you got a deck? So I'll send them the deck. They can go through that in their own time. It means that you have to create a deck that is self-contained, that you have to be able to read it and get the information. You can't sort of rely on having the narrative to go with the deck in that sort of situation. So it's more of an information pack than it is a presentation in that regard. But I also do occasionally refer to the deck. So rather than going through the deck kind of slide by slide, if a particular question comes up, I find that the Q&A kind of structure in these calls or face-to-face, if we get them, is really useful. But then quite often a question comes up and you're like, oh, well, let me just bring up the deck and I'll show you this particular slide. This is our kind of target customer, or these are the members of our team. Or let me just show an example of how the technology works, and I'll actually do a demo. The demos are incredibly powerful as well, as particularly in an early stage company. So the deck still plays a role, but it's not what I lead with. And in fact, in some of the early pitches, I even, when I was fortunate enough to get face-to-face meetings during the pandemic, because we're obviously mostly remote, I'd even get a marker out and would do stuff on the whiteboard and, diagram and sort of brainstorm like that. And I think, I don't know, maybe there's a bit of a psychological trick there that I didn't necessarily intend, but happened anyway, which is I think the VC almost felt like they were contributing to the development of the idea, which goes back to that idea we were talking about before, which was the, ask for advice and you get funding kind of idea. I think that actually wasn't intentional. I wasn't going in to do that, but I think it ended up working out quite well for us.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like you have sort of some psychological pseudo skin in the game. Know? Cool. And then the last point, I guess, when you're post-seed, you start getting a lot more inbounds for investors wanting to talk with you, and now you're kind of screening investors. So actually, all the hard work that you put into like your pre-seed and seed can actually pay off. Obviously, the company needs to survive long enough to get to your next round of funding, but kind of give it that it's a given that you do that. You've done a lot of the hard work for your next round of funding where you can start screening people. However, I'm not sure if you found it to be the case where you actually don't want to take funding from inbounds and you still prefer to sort of headhunt your own investors.
I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this question, but I can share with you my experience. We did get quite a lot of inbound. We got inbound really right after our pre-seed. We were starting to get inbound, and we get loads of inbound now. Even though the market is softening, I probably hear from I would say on average 3 investors a week, 3 funds a week from all over the world. I think the more you're out there, the more that's going to happen. I think it's good to entertain those inbounds. It depends on what stage of the funding life cycle you are. It depends on how confident you are about your raise. And it also does depend on who these investors are that are reaching out to you. So there have been a handful that I've said, look, I don't think we're going to be the right fit for you. I think, most investors are pretty good. They do a reasonable amount of research. Some clearly don't. And, well, you look at their fund and you look at your business and you go, well, I don't think you've actually done your research. It's not going to be a good fit. That happens occasionally, but not very often. I think the other things to remember, and I'll give you an anecdote in a moment. I've spoken at length with some of our existing investors about this, and the inbound thing is not necessarily always a good thing. So take my advice with a grain of salt. It's one founder's perspective, but what I've found is a lot of these inbounds, they don't come from partners. They don't come from senior members of the fund. They usually come from very junior analysts, and nothing against these people, but they are not necessarily the decision makers in the fund, and probably what they're doing is building out their Rolodex, as it were, building out a bit of a leads list of funds that they can talk to. If you do end up talking to an investor, someone who can contribute to the investment decision process, what can happen in particularly in bigger funds, and something that founders should be aware of, is that investor will now have, that they will be the ones who own the deal. If a deal happens, they'll be the ones that have carry. So that means if you end up getting an introduction, or you end up speaking to another investor at the fund or a partner or so forth, that person probably won't be able to invest because it will be the owned deal of the original investor you spoke to. So I think, and sometimes you don't want to necessarily get caught up into the politics of a big fund. So I think being very conscious about how and when you talk to a fund can be important in the process, particularly with larger funds. And remember that this is probably initially, at least, mostly about just getting to know you as a business and adding you to their database. If they're not serious, you'll know pretty quickly if they're not serious about it. Having said that, I've had some wonderful conversations with people that have done cold outreach to us, and some of those folks are very likely going to be part of our next round based on conversations so far. So it can go both ways, but I think it's just helpful as a founder to understand perhaps what that process looks like and what the motivation is from the fund side. And to give you one anecdote, we did get one fund reach out to us right after our pre-seed, actually. We weren't planning on raising again for a while. And they reached out and we had a few conversations, but we realized actually they even put some money on the table. They made us an offer. But through the conversations that we had with them, something wasn't sitting right. The valuation was a little bit low, and that's, all founders are going to say that pretty much all of the time, right? But it felt quite low for where we were at. But also, as we got to know the fund, they were saying some things to us that sort of didn't resonate. So, debating over how much we should pay developers and so forth, and we realized that actually they didn't know this space very well, and that they weren't potentially going to give us the best advice, or that we were potentially going to end up in an unresolvable difference of opinion fairly early. So I think another huge part of the investment process, and it sort of goes back to what I was saying before, is you want to get to know how your investors are going to be thinking about particular challenges, what kind of advice they're going to be giving you. Are you going to end up with major philosophical disagreements early on? And if you get to know them a little bit earlier, you've got a better chance of understanding those ahead of time. So that's also really important.
Thank you for sharing those anecdotes. So I want to take a slight detour to Debugging Diversity. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So Debugging Diversity is a short docu-series. It's a 3-part, 30-minute episode series about, firstly, why there are not many women in the tech industry. But more importantly, it's an action-oriented piece. So every episode unpacks a particular issue or theme and tries to help the viewer with some practical ways that they can either understand better or can actually change the situation in their life or in their workplace. The 3 episodes are sort of loosely separated out into gender bias and stereotypes. The second one is about education and what happens in our education system, what doesn't happen in our education system that perhaps should. And then the final episode is about the workplace, sexism, and a whole bunch of curly topics there. You can actually watch the first episode now online. If you go to debuggingdiversity.com, you can watch the first episode there. Episodes 2 and 3 are still in progress and will be coming out later this year. It's been an interesting project for me because it wasn't actually one that I ever intended to do, funnily enough. It started out as a YouTube channel with a friend of mine. We were creating tech videos, and there was lots of really technical stuff, coding and deep dives on products and so forth. And we wanted to do something a little bit more human. And so I remember sitting around one day having a coffee and sort of brainstorming what we wanted to talk about. And my friend at the time said, "Oh, why don't we talk about why there aren't many women in technology?" And this was quite a lot of years ago now. It was back in 2014. I think to be a fly on the wall back then, we must have looked so naive because we had no idea what we're getting ourselves into. But it sparked this whole journey of discovery for me. I started interviewing people, particularly women, but also men in the space who knew a lot more about this topic than I did. And I realized that it was far bigger than a single YouTube video could cover. In fact, it was originally going to be, after the YouTube video, it was going to be a feature-length documentary. And then I realized it needed to be a series because the series itself is probably going to go on for more episodes, assuming people like it, of course. But there's plenty more topics to cover. So it's been a journey of about 8 years, and it's certainly a labor of love. It's not something that's going to make me any money. I've poured thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands probably into this project. But I do it because it's a story I'm passionate about, and it's something that I think the world needs to hear about.
That's awesome. I mean, I've spoken with a few women that kind of gave their take on where and how this started and some of the root causes of it. Misogyny seems to come up a lot. I guess nodding your head. I guess you covered that in your YouTube video or series. I actually found a really fascinating Washington Post article. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It was called, one second, Women Built the Tech Industry, then they were pushed out.
Yeah, I've seen that article actually, yeah.
So I was actually reading through that today. Obviously, we don't have time to sort of go into the weeds on everything. And seeing as though you have this series, we can point, listeners who are interested towards your series. Perhaps what we can do with the time that we have left, maybe you could just give some really simple advice for founders starting new companies. How can they build in diversity, gender equality from the early days of the company? And I don't know, if it's not the early days, it's not game over. So anything you want to share that could help sort of improve the situation?
So I think the first thing I will say is that, yes, misogyny and sexism are huge challenges in the industry. But I don't actually think that's the primary thing that we should be thinking about. So I should say Debugging Diversity was not a show that I created for women, because let's face it, I am in no position to tell women how to think about sexism. But what I was hoping to create or to become myself is a role model for other men. And I actually break, you look at all men who work in the tech industry, we can kind of break us up into three categories, Brendan. I think there's there are the misogynist, sexist men. I don't meet many of them. They do exist. I think they're in the minority. Then there are the men who really are highly aware of the challenges, are champions and advocates, and do everything they possibly can to change things. They're also in the minority, unfortunately. The vast majority of men in the tech industry are just apathetic. They either don't understand, they don't realize there is an issue, or if they do, they don't know how to address the issue. So I think that's where we need to focus our energy. And I think that's what founders can think about in the early days of business. Number one for a founder is to make a commitment that this is going to be a strategic pillar of the organization. It can't just be left to, a people and culture function or an HR manager or a talent person. It needs to come from the founder, from the CEO. This is something that we care about, because what tends to happen if not, as soon as there's any kind of bumps in the road in a startup's journey, and let's be honest, there are always lots of bumps in the road in a startup's journey. If it's not a top strategic objective to make sure that you have a diverse and inclusive workforce, then any diversity initiatives are just going to get dropped immediately. So it has to be sort of a commitment from the founder from day one. Number two, as a founder, is start to learn about these challenges. There are plenty of articles on the web. Harvard Business Review, I think you mentioned one by the Washington Post. There's so many resources out there, podcasts as well, that you can listen to understand what the challenges are. There's no kind of one or two big things that you need to do. Unfortunately, it's lots of little things. And it's like thinking about, how do you hire? How do you advertise for roles in your business? What are some of the benefits that you give to your employees? So, there's obviously different HR and workplace legislation in different regions of the world. But for example, in Australia, we have a paid parental leave system that's provided by the government. It's only for the primary carer, and I forget what the actual official number is, but I think it's only like two weeks of paid parental leave. We offer at CipherStash, we offer 16 weeks of paid parental leave for either parent. You think about, there's the whole thing to unpack there of gender roles. Like why can't dad stay at home for a period of time? Like our CTO, for example, is on parental leave with his young daughter now. He's taking a couple of months off. We also have an open pay plan, so an open salary plan. So the reason that's important is because gender pay gap is still a thing, and you'll hear all kinds of arguments that there isn't a gender pay gap. There absolutely is a gender pay gap, and that is even ignoring the fact that women tend to be the ones that stay at home to look after kids when they have kids. Take that out, normalize for that, and there is still a gender pay gap. And so one way that you can tackle that, and we see other companies doing this. So Buffer is a classic example, a social media management platform. But we have an open salary scheme in CipherStash so that everybody within the organization knows what everybody else is being paid. We actually don't publish that outside of the organization, but everybody internally knows those numbers. And so that way, if you have two people doing the same job, it's really obvious to the whole company that if they're being paid differently. So that it goes a long way to eliminating things like gender pay gap. And then finally, it's thinking about what's the culture internally to your organization. How do you build an organization? How do you build an organizational culture that is inclusive is one way to think of it, but I like to think of it as building it in a way that everybody feels like they belong. That, we talk about gender a lot, but it goes way beyond that. Like, I have had a story a few years ago of a colleague of mine that he was invited out to lunch, and we were all going out for steak. He is of the Muslim faith, and he needed to eat a halal meal, and nobody in the team even considered that. And so I asked him, are you coming to lunch? And he said, oh, no, that's okay. I'll just stay here and have my sandwich. And I dug a little bit deeper, and then it just clicked. Oh, crap. I just realized he doesn't feel like he can come because he can't eat the food. So it's just really simple little things like that, trying to make sure that you understand, the culture and the, personal preferences and the personal situation of all the members of your team. As you grow bigger, it's much harder for you personally to understand. But if you start to bake that culture into the organization, then your leaders can take that approach as well. And eventually you'll build a much more inclusive workplace and get to that point where everybody feels like they can belong and thrive and, to use the cliche, do their best work.
I really appreciate it. And it's a fascinating topic. And maybe we'll bring you back on for another episode to dive deeper and really expand on this in more detail.
It's a big topic.
Yeah, we could definitely go another hour at least on that. And I already broke the rules of the podcast today. Usually because founders are strapped for time, I try my best to keep it 30 minutes, but this was a fascinating conversation and I really enjoyed it. So I hope our founders will tune in till the end for this one. So thank you so much again, Dan. If anyone would like to continue the conversation, reach out, where's the best place for anyone to connect with you?
Yeah, so, firstly, if you want to check out my business, our business, CipherStash, that's CipherStash.com, CipherStash.com. You can follow me on Twitter. My handle is at Daniel Draper, not Dan Draper, at Daniel Draper. And you can find me on LinkedIn. So I'd love to connect.
Awesome. And that's a pretty memorable name. So hopefully it's easy for people to find you.
Indeed.
And then, we would also be honored to have you join the Founder Pack community. So for anyone listening, if you also want to join, it's an easy URL. It's thefounderpack.com. So thank you, Dan, and thank you everyone for tuning into the Founder Pack podcast.
Thanks for having me, Brendan. It's been fun.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Founder Pack podcast with Brendan Rod, part of the ITSP Magazine Podcast Network. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share the channel and itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey.